So I wanted to start tonight, before we turn to Alien and all of that, there were a few points that I meant to get to last week that I'd like to finish up on, and then we'll turn to tonight's material. We were talking about the unconscious and repression, and I recommended a paper by Stollerow and others, and one of the things that they do usefully add in that paper is that the repression barrier shifts with the intersubjective context. I don't think Freud would have disagreed. In order to maintain needed ties to significant others, we may feel we need to repress feelings and thoughts that we can sometimes allow ourselves to feel in other contexts with other people. So he's sort of saying the repression barrier is not some fixed thing in the mind. It shifts depending on the context, the interpersonal context. And I thought of an example, a good example of this. Wilfred Bion, the British psychoanalyst, he was a tank commander in the First World War. He was severely traumatized in various battles. People around him lost their lives, and he couldn't process the trauma. He was a pretty seriously traumatized man until he met his second wife, Francesca, who just had the qualities that were necessary to contain him. He could begin to talk for the first time. He could begin to put into words the nightmares, the serial nightmares that he had during that war. And somehow he was able to work through the trauma, but he had to wait till he met Francesca to be able to do that. So the repression barrier is not so fixed. Yes?
But was that conscious or unconscious on his part? Because repression would suggest it's unconscious, but I would think that I'm imagining myself in his shoes, like
right.
I'm conscious about that sometimes.
I guess, conscious, it's a bit fluid. I mean, I think he knew he had been traumatized, but the point is that he couldn't let his mind go there. He couldn't let himself consciously remember. I mean, he probably had not forgotten, but he couldn't talk it out with anyone in a feeling way. He couldn't talk it out with himself in a feeling way until he felt safe enough to be somehow contained by her. I mean, I think his sanity was hanging by a thread, and I think if he had gotten into that trauma without being contained by her, he might have had a psychotic break.
Such was his experience. One imagines that he was stuck in a private language situation, like how to convey the horror of his, given that everybody that he knew that went through it was already dead.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was only when it became an actual speech situation where he had a listener and an interpreter that it
right.
could become meaningful for him.
That's right. That's right. In his own language, he talks, he sees the mind, and he sees psychoanalytic therapy as trying to assist in the evolution of the mind, in the evolution of thinking. And he thinks that patients are stuck in certain places, and that in therapy we try to help them resume the development of thought. And the key element of this is the transformation of what he calls beta elements into alpha elements through the application of alpha function. The beta elements are raw, undigestible bits of experience and emotion that just can't be processed unless...
Is that unconscious then? Given that they're beta particles or whatever.
Beta bits.
Beta elements, beta particles.
Yeah.
Are they unconscious or
Pre-conscious?
I somehow think that part of Bion's breakthrough is that he's thinking in a way that's not completely compatible with Freud's categories.
Okay.
I mean, they are to a degree. He's very influenced by Freud. But I'm not sure that the topographic model, conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, fits very well with his own contribution.
They're either beta elements that have been processed through the alpha function.
Then they
into
can become
alpha.
conscious. Then they can become thinkable. It's only by subjecting them to alpha function, alphabetizing them, another term for symbolizing them, putting them into symbolic forms. Only
Is that
then,
what it means?
I think, that's my term. He doesn't use that word.
That's wonderful.
But I came up with alphabetize because I do think, in fact, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about subjecting to linguistic forms. That's my old George Herbert Mead symbolic interaction stuff coming to the fore. So we were talking about alphabetization as a symboling process, which makes experience thinkable. He needed Francesca to be able to do that. Okay, we talked about Freud's great discoveries, repression and the disguised return of the repressed. And of course, the repressed comes back in a million forms, slips, dreams, myths. Eventually, the disguised return of the repressed is present in everything we feel and do. But a graduate student at York had her PhD comps a couple of weeks ago, and from her comp paper, I'm going to read a paragraph, and this is about the return of the repressed, and I'm putting this in the context of what we talked about last week, the article by Fred Cruz attacking Freud, arguing, of course, that psychoanalysis has been scientifically discredited and so on. But here's what Caitlin Jansen wrote. There have been a great many theories developed in the media about Trump's America, some from an important anti-black racism perspective, which cite a white lash, sometimes also called a black lash, against the symbolic, if not exactly structural, gains of the first black president, Barack Obama. Others have speculated that the racist and anti-immigration sentiments are merely side effects of the root issue that, quotes, non-college white men felt abandoned by elitist policymakers and alienated from the prosperity supposedly now enjoyed by those in prosperous cities, by women who are now said to be outperforming men, and by, quotes, illegal immigrants, unquote, who are supposedly stealing their jobs right out from under them. According to this theory, these lost men grabbed onto Trump's message as a beacon of hope in a storm of underemployment, fiscal uncertainty, and dislocated identity. Regardless of angle, what is important to notice, she writes, is that both popular theories attempt to account for the unleashing of powerful resentments, aggressions, and impulses once they've been supplied with a rationalized means of symbolization. In other words, they are theories about the return of the repressed. Freud's theory of the unconscious is perhaps his greatest contribution to modern thought. So she's saying, here we are saying that psychoanalysis has been so thoroughly discredited, and yet these theories are widely discussed as explanations of things like the Trump phenomenon, and they are relying very much on Freudian ideas, like the idea of the return of the repressed. So, okay. Dream theory, we talked a bit last time about Freud's idea that dreams are attempted, disguised wish fulfillments. Sometimes the attempt fails and you get a nightmare because it's not disguised enough, and the raw, unacceptable wishes threaten to break through, causing anxiety and sometimes causing you to wake up. I wanted to make a point here about Bion's very different approach to dreams. I mean, for Freud, dreams are disguises. They need to be decoded. We need to get behind the cover story. Bion is more interested in our capacity to dream per se. I mean, for him, a dream is just a very good thing to have, whether you interpret it or not. It's because what is the dream? It's an attempt to narrate or symbolize, alphabetize, raw experience, to turn it into a story, subjecting raw beta elements to alpha function, that is, to process it. Freud described primary processing and secondary processing, but Bion sees processing period as the fundamental mechanism of the mind. Unprocessed material remain raw beta elements.
Is that bad?
Sorry?
Is it bad to have unprocessed beta elements in your mind space?
It seems to be, because if they're not processed, they are controlling you, you are not controlling them. Trauma that is unprocessed. My colleague here, Joe Fernando, wrote a book a few years ago on defenses, and in that book he introduces paralleling Freud's secondary and primary process. Joe speaks of zero process. And zero process is referring exactly to raw experience that has not been processed. Because it's not been processed, it keeps getting repeated. This seems to be a big part of what Freud was trying to get at with the repetition compulsion. I mean, after all, in analysis, the way we help people break out of a repetition compulsion is by processing early trauma, early experience. So I have an example of zero process. What came out, and it would never have come out if she hadn't been coming that frequently and lying on the couch, was she had always known that her mother was kind of like a lifelong hysteric. And I want to make clear that for me, hysteria is not a female affliction. One of Freud has been roasted for hysteria as a label that has been used to invalidate women as irrational. But people forget that one of the ways Freud got himself into trouble was he came back from Paris and announced that there was male hysteria. He learned that from Charcot. And he was a male hysteric. Now, subsequent psychoanalysts kind of lost touch with that insight, and they kind of colluded with, or at least didn't fight, the general cultural feminization of hysteria as a way of putting women down. There's no doubt about that. But it should be remembered that Freud knew perfectly well that hysteria was just as much a male phenomenon as a female phenomenon. She knew that her mother had been a lifelong hysteric, was always in bed, rarely up until afternoon, a series of largely imaginary illnesses, and so on. But I got curious about what the early years were like with the mother. And she has an older sister, so I instructed her to interview the sister. What I'm saying is that the trauma of her first couple of years of life had been subjected to zero process. The helplessness, the rage. You can imagine the baby didn't become calm like that instantly. It raged and cried and raged, and it got it nowhere, and it finally gave up. It finally gave up and just went quiet. But that unprocessed rage and trauma and feelings of persecution was being projected. Anyway, that's an example of what happens when things aren't processed. The whole world was for this patient, the whole world was her crib. But she had no conscious memory of being in that crib. This was all pre-verbal, unprocessed material. And we began to process it, first of all by reconstructing it, because there are no memories. We had to do a reconstruction of the whole thing. And gradually, over time, she started to calm down and become less controlling, and the whole thing is being processed. Okay, so we are now subjecting that stuff to alpha function. We're using our imagination to create stories. She didn't have a story of her early childhood. Now she has a story of her early childhood. And that's a big part of the way the therapy works. So Bion is very alert to dreaming as a myth-making function. We use our imagination. We create stories. And we're processing our experience.
And I thought I heard you say that you believe the Oedipal myth to be a cultural universal.
Yeah.
So I was driving in my car this morning on my way to work, and I was listening to a family of polyamorous persons, 5 of them, who are gleefully going about the business of making babies together. So they interviewed, this group, they interviewed a series of lesbian couples and the children of lesbian couples who have obviously been raised. The point is that these family forms cannot be called patriarchal in any sense.
Right.
And so just observing these trivial kind of anecdotes from the radio this morning, does it really make that much sense to you that the Oedipal myth could be a historical, transhistorical, transcultural universal?
I believe it is. Did I talk much about the Trobrians and Malinowski?
You mentioned the Trobrianders and
Okay.
the kind of, well, I suppose I get that, but
Okay, let me try to cut to the chase without. I don't have to go back through all the Trobriand stuff. You see, the big debate took place between Ernest Jones, representing the Freud side, and Marxists on the other side, who were using Malinowski's data to say Freud was all wrong, thinking it was about sex. It's about patriarchal. It's about authority, not patriarchal authority. It's about the authority of the uncle in the
Right,
Trobriand
I can sort of
Islands.
go
But
along
it's
with
it's
that.
about power and authority, and oppression and all of that. And Jones defended a very orthodox version, and there are anthropologists to this day who are still following Jones and defending, saying the kid is really jealous about his father having intercourse with the mother. It's projected onto the uncle. It's the father really underneath, they're saying. But the evidence seems to not indicate that. I mean, I think that's a very weak argument when you look at the evidence. Ann Parsons, Talcott Parsons' daughter, went back and reanalyzed the Malinowski field notes. And the culture is full of jokes and taboo avoidances in regard to brother-sister incest. Dirty jokes are all about brothers and sisters getting it on. And if a brother and a sister are passing on a path in the jungle, one or the other of them has to jump off the path into the jungle. They can't be alone together. The culture is obsessed with the idea of them having intercourse. Why? Well, because this culture makes a woman's brother the most important man in her life. He is responsible for raising her children. He's a big man in the village. In his wife's village, he's a nobody. Her husband is a big man back in his village, but in her village, he's a nobody. Divorce is very easy. I divorce you. You're gone. The boy knows that the real man in his mother's life is his uncle, who's not having sex. But it's also not about authority. It's not just about authority. Yeah, he has authority over him. But it's not just about authority, it's about jealousy. This is what Ann Parsons came to. And to me, I think this is why I think it's universal. From Bowlby and the studies of primates, we know we come into the world with innate attachment needs, like the other primates. And so when you're attached, you want to be the apple of the eye. You don't want siblings getting in the way, or uncles or fathers for that matter. And it's not fundamentally about sex. It can become secondarily about sex. But fundamentally, I always make a joke here about the French. The French get this, at least the bourgeois French, because at Mitterrand's funeral, there was his legitimate wife and legitimate daughter, and there was his mistress and his daughter by the mistress, and they were all standing side by side at his state funeral, because among the upper bourgeoisie in France, until fairly recently, probably even still to this day to a considerable degree, because they're different, their culture is different than ours, a man has mistresses, a woman often has lovers, and the couple understand this. So you have your boy toys and you have your girlfriends, but you always come home to Papa, or you always come home to Mama, and we're what really it's about. And if that gets violated, then there's trouble. But if it's merely sex, it's not trouble, okay? So I think that's an example of this, yeah.
So for instance, a daughter, for instance, of two mothers and no father, for instance, could suffer from castration anxiety just because of a fear of losing power when another child comes in, for instance.
Now say that one again. Let me get my mind around this. Sorry.
So you have that, let's say that lesbian couple, the two women
Right.
have a child who's a female,
Right.
who's like young, who's like 4 years old,
Right.
might suffer from a castration anxiety. It has nothing to do with having a penis, has nothing to do with
nothing
having
to
a
do
father.
with it. Right.
It's about power, for instance, about feeling of losing.
Well, I don't know. You see, I don't know that it's about power. I think it's about wanting to be numero uno.
Right.
It's about wanting to be number one. Now, I expect that. I don't know how this would work out in the lesbian couple. The kids always had two moms, or maybe one of the women is the mom and the other woman is the dad. I expect there would be a prioritizing of one of the two, just as there is the prioritizing of the mom in most families, regular straight families. And so our first attachment is the mother figure. And we don't like anyone who gets in the way of that attachment. And we feel rivalry just as much towards siblings. Now, the language of castration and power complexifies this in a way that I don't know is very helpful. I mean, first of all, get into the language of castration. What do we mean? Are we talking about something literal? You see, the Lacanian understanding of castration is so superior. Castration for Lacan has nothing to do with the penis. It has to do with the recognition that there is a fundamental cut. There are two cuts, castrations, two cuts. There is the primordial cut between self and object, self and other, the inner world and the outer world, fantasy and fact. And if you don't make that cut, you're psychotic, because you can't distinguish what's inner from what's outer. Okay, but if you have made that first cut, you then have to proceed to make a second cut, because now that you're not psychotic, the point is you still have the illusion that you could be everything mother wants. Lacan will say, I could be the phallus for the mother. Now, it's his own sexism that makes him use the language phallus there. Why does it have to be the phallus? Why that may fit the codes of a phallocentric culture, but there's no particular reason why the object of desire has to be called phallus. But his point is that the child wants to be everything to the mother.
The golden-haired.
Totally. So that, like, my son, I'm sitting across the table from my wife, and he's in his high chair here. And as long as she's looking at him and I'm looking at him, everything's sweet. But as soon as she looks at me and I look at her and we start having a conversation, milk is spilling, food is flying until the eyes are back. We want to monopolize the look. People who move on to become normal neurotics face the castration. Someone else is the apple of mother's eye. She's looking over my shoulder at dad. Or, if she's in a lesbian relationship, she's looking over my shoulder at dad, who happens to be a woman. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I'm very uninterested in these gender issues. I'm very uninterested in gender. Because I'm interested in these primordial desires. It doesn't matter how you sort it out. Father, uncle, women, whatever, it doesn't matter. This is universal, the desire to be number one. And the trauma that we all have to go through if we're going to be sane, which is to recognize that we can't be God. We can't hold this. And so there's a facing of lack and loss. And that's what Lacan means by castration. A facing of lack and loss. As a primordial element of what it is to be human. Of paternal failure, absence of a father, whatever it was, the cut. And by the way, a literal father doesn't have to deliver the cut. I mean, so a woman is raising her son alone. There's no father. Mother, I'm trying to make the point about the mother performing the paternal function. You don't need a father to perform a paternal function. Mother can do it. The basic function. He wants to be in the bathroom when she's in there going to the toilet. She says no, and she closes the door. He just met his father. It's the bathroom door. It's the no. No, you can't touch me there. I don't want her to go out with her girlfriend to the movies. I want her to stay home with me. But no, she goes out with her girlfriend. She goes to her work. Her work that takes her away from me is my father, is the paternal function. The paternal function is the no, the boundary, the barrier. I think this is universal. I don't see how there could ever be any cultural arrangements that obviate this jealousy complex. And I think these people who think that they can rise above jealousy are totally self-deluded. I think it's almost to like a psychotic degree. And I think in the what do you call that, amory, polyamory movement, you got, well, I've heard of recently of cases where here's a young man I know of whose girlfriend is into this, and he's trying to be hip, and he's trying to pretend that his heart isn't breaking, but his heart is breaking. He won't face it. You know, he's trying to look. I mean, people have always used ideology to mask what they're really feeling. I shouldn't be feeling this, therefore I'll pretend I'm not feeling this. It's politically incorrect to feel what I'm feeling, so I'm going to pretend I don't feel it. But the repressed returns. And this young man that I mean, he's having some kind of a breakdown. You know, in those kinds of circles, to step up and say, I'm jealous, you're mine, I'm not sharing you with anyone, be mine or hit the road. I mean, you know, that's a healthy move to make. Yes?
Is that related to the idea of winning the Oedipal complex?
Well, winning the Oedipus complex is at the same time losing it. You see, the thing about the Oedipus complex is if you win, you lose. If you lose, you lose. Okay? Like, if although in a sense losing is better than winning. Because in a certain sense we all should lose. We all should lose. Otherwise we remain grandiose narcissists, thinking that we're the cock of the walk.
The reality is you lose, you lose.
Well, the reality is that if you lose, you win because you become sane.
Yeah.
You see, but if you actually win and you defeat your father, say, look, I'm looking at it from the boy's point of view, okay? And I've worked with men who were Oedipal winners. One case I know of, the mother just treated the father with contempt. This was a disaster for this kid, okay? I mean, you know, can you imagine the guilt towards his father that he would feel? So there's an Oedipal winner, but boy, did he lose as a result. He was completely messed up psychosexually.
This reminds me of like attachment parenting or something. Like there was like I remember it was a front page story in Time magazine or something of like parents who are mothers that breastfeed their sons or kids until they're like 5, 6, 7 or something. And,
right.
And they had this controversial cover where like this like I don't know 6-year-old was like had the mother's breast in his mouth or something. And, like anyway, so that makes me think of that story. I don't know. It's just
well, that's a very complicated thing.
I think it's great. I mean, I don't know.
I don't. The thing is, like I want to hang on to being a sociologist here. I think we can't ignore cultural context. So that in a traditional Toronto kind of culture, for a mother to be doing that is putting her kid completely out of sync with his whole peer system, and that's got to be bad. Okay, but in Sicily, again, Ann Parsons did a study of a southern Sicilian town, and the kids regularly would run home from grade 1 or 2 or 3 at lunchtime and suckle. But all the kids were doing it. It wasn't a rare phenomenon, so it's going to mean something very different in that context. But you can push that. Now, the sociologists love that. And they're going to push that because they're heavily into sociological relativism. But last year, or the year before, we had a very interesting discussion of exactly this. The question came up whether little kids who are being used for the sexual pleasure of adults in certain cultures that do this. Now, they didn't mean rape, because a kid who's raped knows it hurts, and that's... But kids who are used in other, more sensual, sexual ways. And the question from the sociologist was, if the whole community and the culture is into that, why would that have a harmful effect on the kid? Because the kid wouldn't know it's wrong. Maybe until the kid goes to school in some other place and they're horrified, and then, then maybe it would be harmful. But a woman who works, she was in Guadeloupe she was somewhere in the Caribbean, a very smart psychologist or social worker, and she said, look, I've worked for years with communities who do have that sexualized relationship with their kids. And she said, even though it's acceptable among the adults in the culture, the children are all ashamed. Children are ashamed to be related to this way, even though it's the cultural norm. So the culture is not everything. But on the other hand, the culture can't be ignored, but it's not everything. I found that to be a really instructive, because there are things that are transcultural. And I think this jealousy complex is transcultural. It's going to get sorted out in different ways in different kinship arrangements, but you're always going to have this jealousy complex, one way or another. Okay, let's switch to discussing Alien, but maybe we need to talk a little bit about Melanie Klein. The paper that I wrote about the film Alien was in relation to a paper that was done by Kryn and Glenn Gabbard. And they are American analysts who come out of the mainstream American Freudian ego psychology tradition. And the interesting thing was that they dropped their Freudian ego psychology in the face of this film, and they adopted what they saw as a Kleinian perspective.
Sure, the directors or the critics?
The critics, these two guys two analysts who wrote this paper called Melanie Klein's Night Music or something. It was about the film, Alien. And they were extremely impressed with what they saw as pre-Oedipal themes.
The first Alien movie?
The first one. And they analyzed it in pre-Oedipal terms, and their idea was that they would use Melanie Klein to fill in the pre-Oedipal, because Freud had mapped the Oedipal very thoroughly. So if we take this as a kind of a diagram here, I don't know whether you can see this or not, if I hold it up. Okay, you can? Okay, so basically here are the two positions, the depressive position and the paranoid schizoid position. And we can talk about a transitional area between the two. I try to bring Winnicott's idea of transitional phenomena in here, because not all phenomena in the mind can be so neatly categorized into D or PS.
Sorry, I can't really see the difference between the two positions. Is that on the left or the right?
This line down the middle is an attempt to make a distinction between conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. Last year I used a misleading model. I put conscious up here, preconscious, and then D and PS in the unconscious, but that's misleading. I think sometimes depressive position phenomena can be conscious, sometimes they're unconscious. Sometimes paranoid schizoid position things can be conscious or unconscious. I'm less interested in conscious and unconscious here than I am in the Kleinian distinction between PS and D.
Sorry, are you still talking about the infant experience or recurring emotions in adulthood from an infantile experience?
That because Klein's model is like an archaeological layers model, This begins in infancy, but this structure is the structure of the mind forever after. These are not stages. These are layers of the mind, right? So we never grow out of the PS position entirely. In fact, our experience involves a kind of an oscillation between these two layers. This is a mature position. Reality testing is much more intact.
Is that the depressive position?
That's the depressive position,
Okay.
D. But we start off in PS, which is predominates, splitting predominates. Everything is split. The object is split into all good, all bad. The self is split into all good, all bad. There are no whole objects. There are no whole selves. We split and we project. It's paranoid because we're doing all of this splitting. Sometimes we project the bad out and try to keep the good in, but sometimes we project the good out and keep the bad in. The point is to keep good and bad apart. Doesn't matter which way you do it. But they can't be allowed to touch, because otherwise the good may be destroyed by the bad, and that's disaster. I don't know that it's preferable. I think both of these are disasters. I think to project the good out is a disaster too.
No,
Because
that's what I'm saying, keeping the good in and projecting the bad out
Yeah.
is the better
I don't know that it's
situation.
better necessarily. I don't know that it's better necessarily to keep the good in and project the bad out. Now that you've projected the bad out, your goodness is constantly being attacked by bad persecutors. You're surrounded by bad persecutors who are trying to destroy your goodness. You're paranoid. Okay? Now you look at it the other way. Keep the bad in and project the good out. What now? You have no goodness. The others have all the goodness. You're consumed with envy. And envy can be incredibly destructive. Okay? Now, of course, he was putting his memory function and his thinking function into me. He was putting good parts of his mind into me. I was supposed to carry his memory. I was supposed to carry his thought. I could think, he couldn't think, right? Then he hated me. Hated me because I'm a thinker. And I can remember, I got a mind. He's rendered himself mindless by putting his mind out into me. So he's consumed with envy. That's the downside of that strategy of projecting the good out, because you deplete yourself of the goodness.
So when that happens in infancy, is it ever a good thing that there's primary narcissism to buffer it while the infant brain becomes more organized?
Wow. I see, in order to answer your question, we'd have to have a discussion of what we mean by primary narcissism, which I do not believe exists. You see, Freud believed in it, and what he meant by it was a buzzing, blooming confusion at the beginning when the baby doesn't know what's self and what's other, what's inner and out. And like for Freud, it's a primordial chaos at the beginning. And gradually civilization makes the first boundary, I, not I. And then other boundaries are built on that. And so when patients start getting confused about what's inner and outer, oh my God, says the Freudian analyst, this carefully built up structure of civilization is collapsing. We're going to wind up back in primordial chaos, which is psychosis. So they immediately sit the patient up, get them off the couch, start doing reality therapy, you see. Now the Kleinians never bought this, because one of Mrs. Klein's first disagreements with Freud was to say there's no primary narcissism. That's why she's called. Now, Freud is the inventor of object relations, but she's the first pure object relations theorist, because she says the baby comes into the world having relations with objects from the get-go. Okay, so there's no primary narcissism to regress back into. I mean, she starts out as a Freudian, and in a way she remains profoundly Freudian in many ways, but she never attacks Freud's instinct theory, but she kind of ignores it. And over time, for Freud, instinct was something that had a biological source. He makes this very clear. If you look at his 1911 essay, Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, he defines the instinct as having an aim and an object and a pressure and a source. And he said that these drives are not instincts in the animal sense, because unlike the animal instinct, they are very open to change in the aim and the object, learning, and they can be displaced, and so on. But the source remains a bodily zone for Freud. Okay? Now, Klein doesn't attack that. She just forgets about it. And what drive becomes for Klein is a fully human and psychological phenomenon. It becomes a complex of feelings and fantasies, which always involve a self and another. And so what is libido for Klein? Or what is the life instinct for Klein? It's me feeling good, connected to another who is good, whom I'm loving, and who is loving me. It's loving me and the other. And what is death drive for Klein? It's me, hooked up with a bad other linked by hatred. So it's a fully human phenomenon. And we're no longer concerned about sources. We're just talking about love and hate.
I'd forgotten all of that. That's brilliant. And
Well, I think it's a huge breakthrough, but I think a lot of people who read Klein don't fully get it. So much of the now, coming back to where I was, see, the Americans never got Klein. Now I'm generalizing about a whole culture, but the Americans, except for a few exceptions, Tom Ogden, Robert Caper, but they don't get Klein. Klein is like oil to water. It doesn't get into American culture. You got to go to the Brits to get people who actually understand Klein, because I think the Brits actually read Melanie Klein. I don't think the Americans read her. They read a few secondary sources and they get it all wrong. Let's come back to the model here. So once we overcome splitting and we become capable of ambivalence as we move into the depressive position. Ambivalence is realizing that the object I'm hating, I'm also loving. The object that I love, I also hate. And that makes possible mature object relations. We're not splitting anymore. And because we're not splitting anymore, we're capable of what Winnicott calls the capacity for concern, which is what Melanie Klein meant by her term depressive anxiety. Now, I've always felt it's too bad she called this depressive position, because the word depressive makes it sound like this is where depression should be. No, depression is here. Any depression worth its name involves splitting. You're not depressed unless you feel you're all bad. So when you're depressed, you can be sad in the depressive position, but you can't be depressed. Depression is a regression into PS splitting. Because as long as when you see your bad side, you can remember your good side, you're not depressed.
So what's with the depressive position? What does that vocabulary?
Depressive anxiety is the term she had in mind. Unfortunately, she allowed that to name the position, and people go to depression. What is depressive anxiety? It is Winnicott's capacity for concern. It's my fear that when I was stabbing the monster, thinking I was killing the all-bad monster, it turns out I was deluded. That all-bad monster is also good mommy. Oh my God, I've been stabbing her. Can I get her to the hospital in time, to the emerge? Can she be repaired? And now I'm having a full-blown anxiety attack. Depressive anxiety. Like, I made this terrible error. I've done all this damage. Can it be healed? Can it be repaired? So that's why we associate the depressive position with reparation. This is why I want to call it the reparative position. Because that depressive anxiety or concern leads into the act of reparation. Okay? Now, it gets confusing because where does the Oedipus complex belong? Klein associated Freud's Oedipus complex with the depressive position, and rightly so, because in the Freudian sense, the essence of the depressive position is ambivalence. See, if the little boy just wanted mommy and hated daddy, that's not the Oedipus complex. The poignancy of the Oedipus complex comes from the fact that he hates daddy, who he also loves. Okay? And you can only have that if you've reached the depressive position. So I'm going away to a conference, and my son is running after me. Daddy, don't forget your vitamins. Well, a part of him is hoping my plane will crash and I'll never come back and he'll have mommy all to himself. But another part of him It's very touching. It's poignant. That's true Oedipus conflict. But there is this pregenital triangle, which I don't think should really be called Oedipus. But here you really just hate one object and love the other. Splitting. Paranoid schizoid splitting. And a person who's really into that is capable of murder. I mean, you know, you get in the way of the object I want, I'll just eliminate you. There's no ambivalence. You're all bad. Why would I hesitate to pull the trigger? That's a very primitive pseudo-Oedipus complex. A lot of therapists don't get this. When they see, it's very easy to see triangular conflicts in patients, in everybody's lives. Triangle, the eternal triangle. But don't assume that that's an Oedipus complex. It could be this pregenital triangle, which is very primitive, and it lacks the ambivalence of the real Oedipus complex. Freud was more or less aware of this because he knew that he had mapped the depressive Oedipal layer, which he analogized to the Greco-Roman civilization of those Italian towns. You dig down, the first layer is the Greco-Roman, but if you keep digging, there's a whole Minoan Mycenaean civilization underneath, and they worship female deities. So Freud said the women analysts will tell us about this. Why? Because we learn through transference, and male analysts, Freud at least, was very uncomfortable with these pregenital transferences where patients were trying to turn Freud into a mother. But you don't have. It doesn't have to be. I mean, the psychotherapy is being taken over by women, right? It's becoming a female profession to a very large extent. It doesn't have to be. Men can be mothers. Let's not be sexist about this. You know, there are maternal men. We shouldn't even call it maternal. Even that is playing with the same codes. But the point is that, you know, men can be primary caretakers and can be empathic and gentle and soft and breast-like. But Freud couldn't. Freud was very patriarchal. He left it to the women. Anna Freud, Melanie Klein, mapped the pre-Oedipal layer.
Can I interrupt
Yeah.
you, Professor Coleman? So what is wrong with the male analyst being fatherly?
Oh, there's nothing wrong with it. But there's nothing wrong with a female analyst being fatherly.
Because father isn't just no. Father can be very paternal in a good way.
Oh, absolutely they
Sure.
can. That, of course they can. I prefer to try to avoid the language of maternal and paternal. The point is that children need both empathy and sensitivity and nurturance and structure and rules and some discipline. And we needn't sort this out in a gendered way. A child can get the structure and the no, you can't. He can get that from a mother, from a woman. And a child can get nurturance and sensitivity and empathy from a man. Children need both. They need both. And both of those things can be provided by one parent. It's a tough job, but a single parent can do it. It's a very tall order, but a single parent can do it. Women can father, men can mother, right? Okay. So when the Gabbards turned to this film, Alien, they thought, oh, it's all about mother, so we need to turn to Melanie Klein here. Because they read it as a very pre-Oedipal, completely pre-Oedipal film. So those of you who have got to see the film or remember it, you know, the astronauts, they land on this alien planet, and there's this black, dead alien spaceship, and they go in with their gear on and their tanks and their face masks and everything. They go in and they in the upper level dead aliens are there. their cadavers are there, but they go down into the bowels of the ship, and there's some kind of a like garden or laboratory, and things are growing down there and gurgling, and one of the astronauts looks closely into this pod, and suddenly there springs out of the pod some alien life form which smashes through his faceplate and goes into his throat and plasters itself like a bad breast over his face. And he's unconscious, and it's extending its tentacles down inside. They take him back and they do surgery, and they seem to have gotten this thing off him and out, and he seems to have recovered, and then they're all sharing a celebratory meal when he suddenly starts to heave, and suddenly, smashing through his chest cage, is the alien creature, which then scuttles off into the dark corridors of the ship. And then the rest of the movie is about the hunt for the alien, to kill it. And of course, it's growing, and it's multiplying. The more it's hunted, the more it grows, and the more it multiplies. And there's a computer linked to the authorities back on Earth that's running the ship, and it's called Mother. And there's an android that looks like a male, an older male, a kind of a father figure type male. And it turns out he's not really human. He's an android who is in cahoots with Mother. So he's kind of like Father who's in cahoots with Mother. He's run by Mother. So they're all analyzing this in terms of introjection and projection, and of course Sigourney Weaver, it is all about mothers. The computer is Mother. Sigourney Weaver is trying to be like a strong mother. We could get into the whole controversy of the phallic mother. The Freudians would see her as a phallic mother, but I find that really sexist, because just because a woman is strong, why do you have to give her a phallus? Well, because the law of patriarchy is there can't be any strength unless there's a phallus. If there's no phallus, there's no strength. If there's strength, there has to be a phallus. That's a patriarchal code, right? So if we encounter a strong woman like Sigourney Weaver, we give her a phallus. We call her a phallic woman. I think it's sexist as heck, really, to do that. There's no reason a strong woman has to be given a phallus.
Who gave her a phallus? The critics?
Well, we do in our minds, in patriarchal culture. Oh, yeah, and some Freudian analysts who analyze the film. Yeah.
Would you go so far as to hypothesize that the Minoans and Mycenaeans may have had a matriarchal culture where women were also the discipliners, but that was before, that was in a pre-phallic stage of culture, pre-paternal, so that
Well, that's
female
Bachofen.
leadership was-
That's what Bachofen thought.
Okay.
Do you know about the work of Bachofen?
No.
Oh, he's a really interesting, he wrote about the mother right, and there's a French anthropologist, Briffaut, I'm not sure of the name, who followed Bachofen. Mainstream anthropology pushed him aside, but he's coming back. And Erich Fromm was very influenced by Ludwig Bachofen, who theorized about exactly that, a primordial matriarchal culture. And so Bachofen would certainly have seen the Minoan Mycenaean culture as an example of that. But his work is very interesting along these lines. Okay, so they're very much seeing it in Kleinian terms. They're seeing so Sigourney Weaver, at the end of the film, she's trying to project the alien out into space, and then she's in the pod. She seems to have projected it out into space, but she's in the pod, and she's got a kitten with her. And she goes to sleep for the long trek back to Earth, and you're left with the feeling that somehow the alien's inside that kitten. She thinks the alien is out, but in fact the alien is in. I mean, at the beginning the alien was in the pod, and then it was down his throat and it was inside. It was inside. Then it was outside. This is all introjection and projection. And the film is very much about that, and I'm not disputing the Gabbards for pointing to these dynamics in the film. And when I first saw the film and first read their paper, I thought, right on. The astronauts are inside inside the alien spaceship, like inside the mother, and there are strange sounds. You don't hear articulated speech. It's like you're the baby you're inside the mother, hearing the sounds from outside that are all muffled. I remember thinking Ridley Scott must have been reading Melanie Klein, when he put this film together. It seemed just so much to open up to Kleinian analysis. So a few years went by, and then I saw the film again. And I came out of the theater just scratching my head. Something's not right here. And suddenly it came to me. Holy crap. And the reason I'm talking about this is try to get at the different layers of psychoanalytic interpretation. It suddenly occurred to me that this is an Oedipal. It's not pre-Oedipal at all. On the deeper unconscious level, this is Oedipal. You see, the crew are siblings, and mother wants the alien, which is the newborn. Mother is willing to sacrifice the crew to bring the alien home to Earth. Mother's protecting the baby, and they are enraged about this, the way kids are when a sibling appears. They're absolutely, and they're murderous the way kids are. I mean, Juliet Mitchell, the Kleinian analyst, wrote a book called Siblings, and she says, where there are siblings, murder is in the air. Okay? And it is their murderous rage towards the baby that is causing them to make the alien bigger and bigger and more dangerous. It's their projected murderousness that is creating the murderous alien. Okay, they're suffering from massive persecutory anxiety because of their projected rage. So the siblings, and then, well, here's another Kleinian concept: the combined parent figure. The film seems to show that the computer mother is linked to Ash, the male android, who is. Oh, and there's even some kind of perverse. This Ash, the android, has got a rolled-up girly magazine, which he's trying to attack in a face, trying to stuff down somebody's throat. It's like a phallic thing he's stuffing down, and it's like a sex magazine. I don't know whether you remember that scene, but it's there. He's a perverse father. He kind of goes crazy in this crazy phallic way, but he's in cahoots with the mother. Now that's a paranoid schizoid fantasy of the parents as a perverse couple who are giving each other all of these gratifications. They have a perverse alliance which excludes us, the kids. And the crew are certainly feeling that way towards Ash and the computer mother back on Earth.
Well,
Yeah.
I thought that at that point where it starts showing that down that guy's throat was the point where Ash realizes that the humans might actually have a chance at killing the alien baby, and then that's when they kill him.
They kill him, right?
And then from there, Sigourney Weaver is able to access Mother. She's able to override the father's access because he's gone.
That's right. He's been trying to break that. Yeah, right.
Yeah, because only he had access the whole time, and now that he's gone, she can get in there.
Right.
Find out what it is that Mother's trying to do.
It's interesting. Now that he's gone, she can get in there.
Yeah.
That's a triangular thing right there, right?
That's what might seem Oedipal.
Yeah. Right. That in itself is Oedipal. But the significance of the rolled up magazine who's he doing it to?
For some reason I'm picturing Sigourney Weaver.
He's trying to do it to her.
Yeah. And it's some guy's bunk. And he's
Worth going back and looking at that scene again and trying to figure out what the hell is going on there. But it's a kind of oral rape or something that's being attempted here.
I don't know if it was in that article or if it was something else I read, but they were saying something about there's a lot of like face fucking with phallic objects in it. So like the face grabber thing goes down the person's throat.
Right.
This nudie magazine being shoved down the throat.
Right.
Yeah. And it's being done against men or something like that. That the table has turned.
Right.
I don't know who I read that.
Right. It's kind of unforgettable, that film. Certainly the scene with the thing breaking through I have never been able to get that out of my mind. I almost wish I hadn't seen the film. I'm sorry I asked you to see it, those of you who may have followed my advice and seen it. But, okay, what's the point here? I guess the point is, if we look at the history of psychoanalysis, there has been a big battle between Oedipal analysis and pre-Oedipal analysis. Okay, the classical Freudians, well, and again, unbeknownst to the Gabbards have a limited understanding of Kleinian theory. They fail to understand that Klein moves the Oedipus complex back into the pregenital period. I mean, both PS and D are the first year of life for Klein. Freud doesn't see the Oedipus complex as beginning till like 2.5 years of age. It's between 2.5 and 5. We're talking here, for Melanie Klein, PS is roughly the first 3 months, and we're already moving towards D, between 3 and 6 months. Now, the dating of these things is widely questioned, and I don't have a view on this. I leave that to developmental psychologists and baby watchers to try to sort that out. That's not what's important for me and Klein. What's important is that she's describing the structure of the mind, and I've got plenty of evidence in patients and in myself that there is a paranoid schizoid position, which I frequently visit, especially if I had a bad night's sleep or something's gone wrong in my day, and I become irritable and grouchy, and I lose my capacity for nuance and ambiguity, and everything becomes black and white, and I get paranoid. And then what has psychoanalysis done for me over the years? It's enabled me to more quickly swim back up to the depressive position, and start remembering that I'm a whole self, and that the people I'm involved with are whole objects, and I recover my conscience, my capacity for concern for the other. I mean, that's another big difference, right? PS is narcissism. Because in the paranoid schizoid position, you feel like you are prey for a predator. You're being hunted by the alien, by the bad object.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, by the way, this film, Alien, we should talk about building walls to keep out Mexicans and Muslim bans. Keep out the aliens. We got to keep the aliens out. That's paranoid schizoid. That guy is so totally paranoid schizoid. I mean, he's the poster boy for pathological narcissism. I mean, but see, because you're being hunted, you don't have time to think about other people. There's no empathy. It's kill or be killed. Freud sort of understood this. Freud said that if you want to become a narcissist, all it takes is a toothache. Your tooth is aching. You're not thinking about anything but yourself.
Who said that?
Freud himself. I mean, it's all about the pain you're experiencing, and you have no capacity to get your mind beyond yourself. So the move into D makes awareness that there are other human beings who are actually real. For people who function predominantly in PS, other people are not fully real. They can do this for me, they can do that for me, but it's really all about me. But boy, to get into that, and even like to define what we mean by masochism would take a lot of work to begin with. Certainly when psychoanalysts talk about masochism, mostly they do not mean what the culture generally means by the term masochism, which is taking pleasure in pain. That's what the culture means, getting pleasure out of pain. That's not what psychoanalysts mean. When we talk about masochistic characters, we talk about people who seek failure, pain, punishment, not because they like it, not because it feels good, but because they feel they deserve it. It hurts. They don't like it, but they feel they must. They're driven by a superego that says, you know, you must suffer. So they seek suffering. It's not that they like it. Just because people seek something doesn't mean they like it. Yeah. The history of psychoanalysis, the classical people were very focused on the Oedipal phase, and understood in Freud's terms, 2.5 through to 5 or 6, and they were very focused on the Oedipal triangle from that period. But it was often very difficult to get those analysts, who were predominantly male analysts, to talk about the mother issue. But the idea of pre-Oedipal conflict, of conflict simply on the level of the mother and the child, and something going wrong, and deep disappointment in the mother, and hatred of the mother, and guilt for hating the mother. This stems from Freud's own problem. There's an interesting book by Deborah Margolis called Freud and His Mother, and Freud had a real blind spot for his mother. She, it seems, was a very narcissistic woman who was invested in him as a narcissistic object, you know, my son, the great whatever. He was bringing glory to her. Did she love him for himself? She lived on. You see, he lost his father when he was 40. But she lived on into her 90s. In his 70s, he was still visiting her every Saturday morning.
Sorry, who was 40, the father or Freud?
Sorry?
When Freud's father?
Freud's father died when Freud was age 40. And the mother lived on into her 90s, so he was still visiting her in his 70s. And he kind of kept her on a pedestal. But Margolis amasses a lot of data from letters and comments that he's made and so on, but her theory is that he really hated his mother. He could not face the fact that he hated his mother, and therefore kept her on this pedestal. And he kind of blocked out the whole pre-Oedipal period, but that's also because that's when he lost his Catholic nanny. As a little boy, he had this Catholic nanny, and the nanny would take him to Mass with her, and he would come home and he would give sermons in the Jewish family, mimicking the priest, and he was very taken with the smoke and the statues and all of the mystery of the Catholic Mass. And then the mother fires the nanny.
Was Freud where that happens?
2, 3. He was maybe around 3 when the mother fired the nanny. And the reason the mother gave was that she found in the nanny's possessions some small objects, coins and things, the sorts of things the little boy would make a present to his beloved nanny. Mother uses that as an excuse to, but she doesn't just fire the nanny, she sends her to prison. And so first of all, there's trauma. He loses his beloved nanny. There's Paul Witz, the historian. He admits that there's not conclusive evidence, but Amelie, Freud's mother, was Jacob's third wife, and he was like 20 years older than her. So she was in her late teens or early 20s when Freud was born, and he had 2 sons from a previous marriage who were about the same age as his new young wife. And one of these sons lived across the street. And Jacob was a wool merchant and traveled. And he was out of town a lot. And if something funny was going on between his young wife and the grown-up son from the previous marriage, who would know about it? The nanny. Freud displaced the action psychologically upwards. He displaced upwards from his area of trauma, which was pre-Oedipal. And he became obsessed with the Oedipus complex because that's away from where his hurt really was. And so that's back in the oral and anal phase. And here's Freud smoking the 20 cigars a day. And then he develops mouth cancer. And he has 36 operations for the jaw. And at the end, he's got this mechanical apparatus in his mouth. So here he is, traumatized in the oral phase. And so then, beginning sometime in the 60s, psychoanalysis began to bifurcate into what I think of basically as two. They see themselves as subgroups, but basically, on the one hand, you have your Freudians and your Kleinians and your Lacanians. And on the other hand, you have your self-psychologists, attachment theorists, Winnicottians, Fairbairnians, Guntrippians. You have your relational psychoanalysts, Stephen Mitchell and all of those people around relational psychoanalysis, and you have your intersubjectivists, Stollerow, Atwood, Brandshaft, all of those people. And two very different approaches to understanding what psychoanalysis is and how it works. Now there is some overlap. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify here. I think a lot of Kleinians overlap. I mean, I'm fairly Kleinian, but I'm also Winnicottian, and I'm very influenced by Kohut, and this distinction breaks down with the Kleinian tradition. Because obviously Klein was a relational analyst. She's an object relations thinker. And she sees the analysis as very much about projection and introjection and transference and countertransference. It's very much an analysis of what's going on. But the unconscious remains central for Klein. She's interested in unconscious processes. She's interested in the unconscious relation that's going on between therapist and patient. Whereas many of the members of these other schools are much more operating on the level of conscious and preconscious. It's all about affective attunement. It's all about empathic contact, contact with the patient.
So there's no concept of repression in those thinkers?
Yeah, a lot of them have completely lost it. And certainly it's very interesting to talk about the concept of resistance. Key Freudian concept. It goes with repression. That which is pressed down, there is resistance to having it come back up. Okay, for some of the relational people, they think that if the analyst is at all thinking that his patient is resisting, the analyst is doing nothing more than confessing that he's got a big countertransference problem. Because if he was in empathic contact with his patient, he would not be thinking the patient is resisting. He would be understanding why the patient's behaving the way he's behaving. He wouldn't be seeing it as resistance. Some of the extremists in the relational tradition, they feel they're very morally disapproving of giving interpretations to patients. They think it's psychological rape. It's the analyst the analyst is always seen as a dogmatic ideologue. They often work with these stereotypes of dogmatic, ideological, patriarchal, phallic Freudians, and Kleinians, and Lacanians. Because, the Lacanians, the law of the father, and it's very Roman Catholic, and it's very much about the law, and the le nom du père, the name of the father. So these relational people really think that the Freudians, Kleinians, Lacanians are patriarchal ideologues trying to program the patients according to their theories, and that this amounts to a kind of psychological violence. So you can see why these schools of thought can't really talk to one another very easily, except for those of us who are kind of in the middle. Now, there's an ever-growing, I think this split it was very wide in the 70s and 80s. I think in some ways it's not as wide as it was, because I think more and more of those of us who try to integrate. Okay, like, now take Bion. Bion comes out of the Kleinian tradition. And he never really challenges Klein and Kleinian assumptions, but Bion is all about maternal containment. Pathology is not because of... Now, in his early papers, he's still talking the Kleinian line about inborn constitutional aggression and inborn large quantities of destructive envy. He will talk that way. But as we move along in Bion's thinking, pathology is rooted in failures of early containment. Now, of course, he's not mother bashing, because he's saying that a mother who's perfectly capable of containing several of her infants may not be able to contain the third. And it may not because of any fault of her own. It may be that this baby is just on a different wavelength, you know, and she can't learn to dance with him the way she could learn to hook up with the other kids. I mean, Bion would never deny that babies come with different temperaments from day one. He's not saying, he doesn't buy the blank slate theory at all. And so some mother-infant couples just are all over one another's feet. And it would be simplistic to just blame the mother. But the result of that is, whether it is mother's narcissism or depression or whatever, or it's this more complicated situation, the result is that the baby can't project into the mother. She can't receive his projections. He's projecting painful, raw beta elements into her in the hopes that she will be able to contain them and process them with alpha function, and then hand them back to him in a digestible form, which he likens to a process of detoxification. The kid is persecuted by these toxic, painful, poisonous feeling emotions. He's got to put them in the mother.
Like what? Like hunger?
Well, like hunger, like the pain in his gut, like being cold, being dirty, just suffering. And he has no words.
So when you say project, you don't mean project as in the
well, I mean
defense.
projective identification, which means Freudian projection is operating on the level of the depressive position, so I'm putting ideas into you that I don't want to have. But we're talking about a more primitive, earlier, pre-verbal projective. By the way, the Kleinians would never agree with Freud and Lacan that psychoanalysis is a talking cure. They would never agree. Because the Kleinians always have understood that, well, that's okay for high-level neurotic patients. They come with verbal and they talk, right? But more disturbed patients, they don't bring talk. Or the talk they bring is indecipherable, or it doesn't go anywhere. What then do they bring? They put disturbing feelings into the therapist. And if the therapist doesn't get that, if he thinks that he is going to get, if his goal is to get these patients to benefit from talk, he's just going to make them worse. And the patient is acting out more and more, because the patient is saying, look, don't you get it, you dummy? I mean, I'm trying to communicate with you, you arrogant SOB. You're insisting I communicate in your way. I'm not going to communicate in your way. I need to communicate in my way. And my way is by putting emotions into you. And you're not receiving them. You're hurling them back. Okay? So Bion is saying that the mind gets going with the mother being able to tolerate and contain and process through her reverie. Baby's putting these disturbing feelings, and mother is saying, oh, you're hungry. Oh, let me give you some food. Okay, she's naming it. She's understanding, she's defining it, and she's handing it back in ways that he can now internalize. So that's maternal containment. So what I'm saying is that insofar as he sees pathology as stemming from failures of maternal containment, he's more like the relational people. Even though he comes out of the Kleinian tradition, he's shifted. He's brought mother big time into Kleinian theory, although she was always there as the breast. But Klein was operating with the idea of the child, working on the child's fantasies of good breast, bad breast, and so on. He's bringing the real mother in a big way. I'm not saying the real mother was absent in Klein. She was always there. Klein emphasized the importance of the real good mother. There's no doubting that. Although the Americans don't ever get that. The Americans insist that's not true because they don't read Melanie Klein. If you actually read Melanie Klein, you would see that over and over again she's stressing that the real mother is important because only taking in the real mother's goodness can offset the fantasy of a persecutory mother. The baby's going to feel persecuted. And it's only by taking in the mother's goodness that persecution can be offset. So the real mother's not absent in Klein, but Bion makes the mother much more important in terms of her job of containment of projective identification. So here are the Bionians. They come out of a tradition, yeah, it's relational. They make it much more relational. They don't fit entirely very well with the Stephen Mitchell people because they work with the unconscious. And they also have an attitude. They have an attitude as to what analysis is. And Bion's fundamental attitude is patients need analysis because they can't think right. Because their minds have gotten stuck at an earlier phase of mental evolution. And they need analysis to help them resume the development of the mind and to move on. And because for Bion, the mind is about truth. The mind needs truth the way a plant needs water. And the mind is an apparatus for approaching truth. And the mind grows sick with lies and illusions and delusions. And patients need truth, but they don't want it because it hurts. So I'm trying to help the patient think better so that he can face truth. But he doesn't want to face truth because it hurts so much. So Bion is a theorist of resistance, and that doesn't fit with the relational people. They think that the cure is all through building a relationship between therapist and patient. Which I think the relationship is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. I mean, I have to build a good relationship with my patient. Because only then can he and I together approach truths that he doesn't want to look at. But maybe if he's gotten really well connected to me, and we look at those truths together, maybe we can bear it. Okay? But what's the cure? The cure isn't the relationship with me. The cure is looking at the truths and being able to bear it. That's the real cure. The relationship with me is just a means towards being able to do that. See? The relational people are taking the relationship as almost the essence of the whole process. Yeah.
But doesn't that lead to an inevitable countertransference?
Oh, definitely it does, and a lot of I think it's very dangerous because it stimulates the therapist to think that, look, my patient has been wounded by bad mommy and daddy, but thank God for them, they found me, and I'm going to be the good mommy and the good daddy, and this is reparative reparenting. The patient is getting reparented, and it's my goodness that is going to flow. into the patient. Now, the patient is sick because something's missing. Okay? And I'm going to pour in the love, the empathy, the understanding that was missing. But meanwhile, the patient isn't getting any better. And the analyst is getting infuriated. Here I am pouring all my goodness into this deficit, this hole, this vacuum. Well, I guess my empathy isn't good enough. Maybe I need to put more of myself into the hole. Kohut offered 2 fingers for a patient to hold, thereby breaking the non-touching rule. And I'm not saying that it's only self-psychologists or relational analysts who lose their licenses by joining patients on the couch. Plenty of Freudians and Lacanians. I mean, I would never make that claim. But I'm saying there's something about the theory which is dangerous.
So, the curacy and the truth and dealing with it, you kind of said. So, like, if your patient is projecting into you kind of their unhappiness with you, but they're saying you're unhappy with them because you're like, you know, I don't know, you're late, but you're not late, you know, things like that, like things that aren't true. Right. Like, so what is, would you confront them and say, well, actually, look, it was 10 o'clock when we started, it wasn't like 10:15. I don't know, like, what is...
Yeah.
How do you, yeah?
I would confront, but, you know, I don't, the word confront is very misleading. It has this military confrontation, you know? I mean, the idea of a confrontation, as Freud, he chose that word, unfortunately, but what he really meant by confrontation was simply drawing the patient's attention to something. Mm-hmm. So, so you have the impression I came in later. My impression was that it was 10 o'clock when I came in. Mm-hmm. But of course, I could be wrong. I mean, my watch might be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Right, you soften it.
I make it into an inquiry. So you had that impression. I wonder, well, maybe I was late. It's possible, but I don't think so. My watch tells me what. So we might look at the cell phone, you know, and see, or we might not go to even finding out who's right and who's wrong, but just, it's interesting. I mean, like, even if I arrived right at 10, you had the feeling that I was late. So you had the feeling, I get it, you had the feeling my mind was elsewhere, or you had the feeling that I was prioritizing something over you. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Mm-hmm. Where does that take us? So I would turn it into that kind of inquiry. But yeah, sometimes I think one really has to confront realities with patients. One ought to do so kindly and gently as possible, but sometimes one has to do that and confront distortion. Oh, here's another thing. Like the extreme intersubjectivists, they think that just as if the analyst is thinking that the patient is resisting, that shows that the analyst has a problem. So they would say that the analyst who thinks the patient is distorting is just an authoritarian. Why, you know, like they have no room for the concept of distortion.
That's quite preposterous. Why would a patient be seeking this kind if their mental processes were so undistorted and so not suffering from the it doesn't even make sense. The only person that's got a problem in this room is the analyst.
Well, see, I think Stollerow and those guys, they had very authoritarian fathers, and they had very authoritarian analysts, and they think that when the analyst talks, and they have, I have to grant them that they have a kind of a point to a degree, because what makes the analyst think that he has the arbiter as to what's distorted and what isn't? What makes him think that he has the touchstone to truth? The point, so that where I object to them is they throw out the concept of distortion altogether. I say, let's democratize it. Sometimes I, the analyst, am distorting, and the patient helps me with my reality testing. And sometimes the patient is distorting, and I help him with his reality testing. And together we try to correct for one another's distortions, and we try to arrive, therefore, at truth through a democratic dialogue. But they think that the analyst who uses the concept of distortion is always thinking he knows the truth and the patient's distorting. Well, I mean, an analyst who operates that way is wrong. I mean, that's not the way you ought to operate in analysis. That is analyst authoritarianism. But you don't have to throw out the concept of distortion to overcome analyst authoritarianism, right?
Sorry, what would be authoritarianism if you
It's for the
insist
analyst
that,
to smugly sit there and think that he knows what's
Right.
what's true, and the patient doesn't.
Right.
I
Your
mean,
dream really means this.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Even if you think it means that, I know I'm the analyst. That would be.
Authoritarian,
the patient comes in and says, I haven't said a word yet, but he comes in and he says, so, what's with you today? I said, well, what do you mean? Well, you look grumpy. Did you have a bad night's sleep? You look really pissed off about something. And I'm saying, no, I don't feel. Well, of course, look at the way you just reacted. It's proof. Now, of course, this is how projective identification works, because what's happening? I'm starting to get pissed off. I'm starting to have the very feelings that this person is attributing to me, because they're attributing them to me. But, you know, the point is that sometimes patients pick up things that we are completely unconscious of. Now, I don't, Ferenczi went heavily into mutual analysis, and I'm not advocating that. I'm not saying, okay, to the patient, today I'll lie down, you sit in the chair. No. But sometimes patients are quite aware of things that I'm not yet conscious of. And I believe it can happen. They can pick up on unconscious. Patients can sometimes, especially very disturbed patients, for some reason, they can pick up on things in us that we are not aware of. And therefore, if a patient picks up on something in me that I just don't think is there in me, I'm not so quick to say you're wrong. I'm not so quick to say you're distorting. What I will say is, I don't have any conscious awareness of that, but look, I'll think about it, and I'll check out my dreams tonight, and, you know, maybe you're onto something. I don't know. On the other hand, I'm not going to react quite that way if the patient is close to psychosis, because then I don't want to seem to be supporting something that is pretty obviously delusional, you know. So that's a matter of clinical judgment, but.